The subcommittee will come to order. And before I start with my opening statement, I want to recognize my classmate, my friend Lois Capps, who has announced her retirement, although I imagine she'll be a pain in our side for a year and a half yet. So a very nice pain, that's right. So I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Today marks an important milestone in our effort to modernize TSCA. The more we work together, member to member, on a bipartisan basis, the more we understand each other and how much we hope to accomplish. Our subcommittee has put in a lot of hours on TSCA over the past couple years, and actually I would say the past couple weeks, and that effort, we believe, is about to pay off. It's gratifying to work directly with members on both sides of the aisle who bring so much dedication to the task. A week ago, we unveiled the bill before us today. Besides the bill language itself, that announcement carried a couple of other important messages. First, members have been working together directly, challenging each other to find common ground and discovering that we share many policy objectives. Let's talk about some of those policy objectives. First, I think we all want EPA to do objective, science-based examinations on some of the chemicals that are already on the market. EPA already has some of these in mind to evaluate because EPA thinks they have a potential for unreasonable risk of injury to human health and the environment. Meanwhile, if manufacturers want to take a proactive approach and ask the agency to perform a risk evaluation, we are okay with that as long as it meets the same rigorous science requirements as one EPA itself initiates, and the manufacturer is willing to pay the EPA administrative cost of performing the work. We also want to continue protecting confidential business information, but for CBI claims made after our bill becomes law, we'd like manufacturers to reestablish those claims at least once every 10 years. We think EPA should be allowed to mandate testing on a chemical in order to complete a risk evaluation, since the risk evaluation step is new to TSCA. These are just a few of the provisions that appear in the discussion draft. I think we also agree that the process is and should be moving forward. Leading members on both sides are committed to that momentum. We'll listen carefully to stakeholders on what they like in the draft, and we welcome suggestions they have for improvement. We'll collect those comments, and then we'll sit down as a subcommittee and make decisions. Members should plan on a subcommittee markup about a month from now on May 14th. To facilitate our work, we'll publish a revised bill text reflecting consensus revisions in time to use as a subcommittee markup vehicle. And I'll be asking Chairman Upton to schedule it for full committee consideration as soon as practical after the subcommittee has done its work. I thank all the witnesses today for their willingness to participate. Assistant Administrator Jim Jones, you are no stranger to this committee. Your agency has already offered some informal technical assistance for which we are grateful, and we expect to continue working with you on it until the final version passes both bodies of Congress and is signed by the President. We also welcome our second panel of witnesses. You are all also friends to this committee, and we've been grateful for your perspective in the past. We look forward to hearing from you on this fresh new approach. Finally, I thank Chairman Upton and his full support on this bill, and my friends Paul Tonko and Frank Pallone and the subcommittee members, and I would say the subcommittee staff on both sides for all their active participation and partnership in this project. Let's all keep working together to get this vitally important legislation enacted. And with that, I yield back my time and yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I certainly appreciate the tone. I value the friendship and partnership we have in serving this subcommittee. Good morning to each and every one of our witnesses and to my fellow panelists here. Thank you, Chair Shimkus, for calling this important hearing, this very important hearing. Our subcommittee spent a good deal of time on the Toxic Substances Control Act in the last Congress. We had a number of very good hearings covering many of the provisions of the current law. And although we did not get to an agreement, the exercise provided the members of this subcommittee with a much better understanding of the current law and its associated shortcomings. It is a new Congress. We have another opportunity to develop a bill to address the key problems with current law. For much of the past 37 years, TSCA served the industry well, but I would caution that TSCA needs to be balanced it needs to serve all perspectives well. Existing chemicals remained on the market, and new chemicals entered commerce through a limited review process that does not require licensing or compel the production of minimal data sets. Information provided by chemical manufacturers could be labeled as confidential business information with less review of whether the CBI claims were justified or not. Even in the face of strong evidence that a chemical substance indeed presented a significant risk, the Environmental Protection Agency was unable to act. For all practical purposes, TSCA has no enforceable safety standard. Under the law's standard of unreasonable risk and the requirement to produce substantial evidence, the burden of proof of harm, as interpreted by the courts, is too high to enable EPA to address even well-characterized risks. In addition, the agency has insufficient resources and little authority to require manufacturers to produce information for an adequate evaluation of those chemical risks. This is especially true for thousands of older chemicals that remained in commerce with no evaluation from the time the law was passed to the present moment. The overriding problem with TSCA is that the public has no confidence in this federal program. As a result, the public does not believe that the presence of a chemical in the marketplace has any relationship to its safety. That is not good for industry and is not good for the public. The federal program must have credibility. The discussion draft that is the subject of today's hearing represents a significant departure from the proposal offered by Senator Vitter and Senator Udall, and I believe that's an important step here in this House. It is also different from the approach taken in the House last year. So I believe that this draft has a number of benefits relative to these two other proposals, and that is a very beneficial thing in this process. I want to commend the Chair for working with us and demonstrating a desire to discuss and address concerns raised by Democratic members and by different stakeholders and interest groups. I appreciate and applaud the Chair's decision to narrow the scope of this effort and to focus on the key problems with TSCA. Again, I appreciate the partnership and the friendship, but there's much more work to do, and I am prepared to work with you, as are the other members of our subcommittee, Mr. Chair. My hope is that we can produce a bill that all members of our subcommittee can support, one that truly can become law. If we are to do that, the final product must reflect compromise and gain the support of a broad coalition representing all of the major stakeholder groups, and it must have the support of the administration. I believe we can get there, and that this discussion draft makes a great start toward the goal of passing a law. But I do not want to mislead anyone. There are still some tough issues to address. A new TSCA must do more for public health and the environment than the current law. It must preserve state authority to act to protect their citizens in the absence of meaningful federal action, and changes in policy alone will not be enough. The agency must have adequate resources by which to fulfill its obligation to the public and to the regulated community. A reformed TSCA should generate more innovation, not more litigation. I want to thank all of our witnesses who are participating in today's very important hearing. Your input on this draft legislation will be very important to our efforts as we move forward. And again, I would like to thank you, Mr. Chair, and commend you for tackling this important and very challenging issue. It's not easy. I look forward to working with you and the other members of this subcommittee to complete this very important task. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time, and you know, without objection, what I'd like to do, Mr. Jones, is allow you to go for 5 minutes, and then when Chairman Upton and the ranking member come after that, we'll let them give their opening statements. And with that, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko, and other members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to join you today to discuss the much-needed reform of chemicals management in the United States and the opportunity to engage early on the recently released discussion draft of the TSCA Modernization Act of 2015. As you know, chemicals are found in almost everything we buy and use. They contribute to our health, our well-being, and our prosperity. However, we believe it is essential that chemicals are also safe. TSCA gives EPA the jurisdiction over chemicals produced, used, and imported into the United States. However, unlike laws that are applicable to pesticides and drugs, TSCA does not have a mandatory program that requires EPA to conduct a review to determine the safety of existing chemicals. In addition, TSCA places burdensome legal and procedural requirements on the EPA before the agency can request the generation and submission of health and environmental effects data on existing chemicals. As a result, in the more than 3.5 decades since the passage of TSCA, the EPA has only been able to require testing on a little more than 200 of the original 60,000 chemicals listed on the TSCA inventory, and has regulated or banned only 5 of these chemicals under TSCA's Section 6 authority, the last of which was in 1990. In the 25 years since, the EPA has largely relied on voluntary action to collect data and address risks. In the absence of additional federal action, an increasing number of states are taking actions on chemicals to protect their residents, and the private sector is making their own decisions about chemicals to protect their interests and to respond to consumers. It is clear that even with the best efforts under current law and resources, we need to update and strengthen TSCA and provide the EPA with the appropriate tools to protect the American people from exposure to harmful chemicals. The EPA believes that it is critical that any update to TSCA includes certain components. In September of 2009, the administration announced a set of 6 principles to update and strengthen TSCA. While the administration does not have a position on the discussion draft, there are several important observations that I'd like to offer. The discussion draft provides EPA with more effective authority to compel the generation of health and safety data on existing chemicals. The discussion draft should give EPA the authority to set priorities for conducting safety reviews on existing chemicals based on relevant risk and exposure considerations. The draft includes 2 means by which risk evaluations could be initiated for existing chemicals. The first is that EPA would be required to conduct a risk evaluation upon a finding that the combination of hazard from and exposure to a particular chemical substance has the potential to create an unreasonable risk of injury to health or the environment. The second allows for a chemical manufacturer to request EPA conduct a risk evaluation for a particular chemical substance. In practice, this would likely lead EPA focusing the majority of its limited risk evaluation resources on completing evaluations for chemical substances requested by industry, which once requested start the clock ticking on a number of deadlines. This could result in evaluations for the chemicals with the most potential for risk being put off indefinitely while EPA works on the evaluations requested by industry. Additionally, the requirement that EPA make an affirmative finding of potential for unreasonable risk prior to initiating a risk evaluation creates a possible analytical catch-22 in which EPA must make a finding regarding the potential risk prior to beginning the risk evaluation process. I note that once the EPA is able to conduct an evaluation that finds risks, the discussion draft appears to impose rigorous deadlines for imposing regulatory action to reduce these risks. However, in many cases, those deadlines in the draft are unreasonably short. The use of TSCA Section 6 to limit or ban a chemical that poses a significant risk has been a major challenge. The discussion draft clearly removes TSCA's requirement that the EPA demonstrate it is using the least burdensome requirements needed to provide adequate protection. The draft appears consistent with Principle 1 in that it specifies that risk assessments should include consideration of information on potentially exposed populations, but not information on costs and other factors not directly related to health and the environment. The discussion draft, however, is ambiguous on how EPA is to incorporate cost and other factors into a risk management rule under Section 6A. In the current discussion draft, the cap on fees is eliminated. However, there are not provisions that ensure EPA will be given a sustained source of funding for implementation as articulated in Principle 6. The discussion draft is consistent with the administration principles in the area of transparency and availability of information on chemicals, including giving EPA the ability to share chemical data with state, local, and tribal governments. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for your leadership on TSCA reform. I will be happy to answer any questions you or other members have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your opening statement, and I appreciate the comments. And now I'd like to turn to Chairman Upton and thank him for his friendship and support as we move forward, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is today an important milestone as we work to bring our chemical safety laws into the 21st century, and I thank Chairman Shimkus for his bipartisan member-to-member work bringing this legislation before the subcommittee. Also commend the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for collaborating across the aisle to develop a proposal that, in fact, we all can embrace. We've heard from a diverse cross-section of stakeholders that TSCA needs modernizing. When first enacted nearly 40 years ago, the structure was a bit of an experiment. When our predecessors on this committee designed TSCA, they were clearly attempting to reconcile diverse points of view within Congress and with the American public. But our challenge today is the same, but now we have the benefit of experience. Our witnesses include the administration's main point person on chemical regulation, industry experts with global regulatory experience, and a person who manages a chemical business on a day-to-day basis. As someone responsible for meeting the payroll, she may have the most valuable experience of all. And we look forward to all of your testimony today as we collectively work together in the days ahead to get the project done. Last year, we spent lots of hours, countless hours, trying to develop bipartisan legislation, only to find that we put more issues on the table than we could resolve. Drawing on that lesson, this year's bill is a little bit more focused. First, it kicks the starting process of selecting chemicals already in commerce for risk evaluation, and if necessary, rulemaking to mitigate that risk. From among chemicals already on the market, EPA selects ones that it sees as potentially posing an unreasonable risk. Second, the bill also lets the market select chemicals for risk evaluation by allowing a manufacturer to ask for and pay for an evaluation. In either case, the risk evaluation must stand up to rigorous scientific standards set out in the legislation. If EPA does identify an unreasonable risk, it must turn immediately to drafting a rule tailored to mitigate that risk. These rules will focus on the danger at hand. Once written, those rules will be shared by all Americans. Rooted in science, the EPA decisions will obviate state-by-state attempts to regulate interstate markets. And everyone from moms in Michigan to consumers around the world will have the confidence that a chemical cleared by EPA won't harm them or their families. So let's continue the bipartisan momentum, get the legislation through this committee and the full House. This is the year for meaningful reform, and I again want to particularly thank Mr. Shimkus for his strong work to get a bill to the plate where we can finally get some runs scored. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back this time. Chair now recognizes Ranking Member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to be here today to continue this subcommittee's important work to reform the Toxic Substances Control Act. Chairman Shimkus's new discussion draft, the TSCA Modernization Act of 2015, is a thoughtful and innovative approach that has the potential to move chemical regulation forward. The chairman and the majority staff have worked closely with Democratic members, including our ranking member, Mr. Tonko, to improve this draft, and I'm happy to say that our work is ongoing. I look forward to hearing from EPA, affected industries, and environmental stakeholders this morning to plot a course forward and begin to strengthen this draft. Improving the federal government's ability to identify and manage risks from the chemicals that are manufactured and processed in this country is critical. For 6 years now, there has been widespread agreement among industry, labor, and non-governmental organizations that TSCA needs to be reformed. In 2009, the EPA administrator said that TSCA had proven to be, quote, an inadequate tool for providing the protection against chemical risks that the public rightfully expects. The American Chemistry Council said it wanted to work with stakeholders, Congress, and the administration to make reform a reality. And a coalition of public interest groups said that by updating TSCA, Congress can create the foundation for a sound and comprehensive chemicals policy that protects public health and the environment while restoring the luster of safety to U.S. goods in the world market. At that time, stakeholders and policymakers pursued a vision of a fully reformed TSCA, ensuring that no chemical would go to the market without being found to be safe. All chemicals in commerce would be subject to minimum testing, and aggressive regulation would ensure to the American public a reasonable certainty of no harm from the chemicals they are unwittingly exposed to every day. 6 years later, that vision is still my goal, but the risks from toxic chemicals in our environment and the products we use every day are serious and pressing, and progress towards that vision has been elusive. This new discussion draft does not attempt to realize the goal of a fully reformed TSCA with assurances that all chemicals in commerce are safe, but it will give EPA tools to reduce risks now in a package that I think has the potential to become law. And it will give consumers the ability to choose chemicals and products that have been reviewed for safety against a purely risk-based standard. Under this draft, EPA would have the ability to require testing through orders rather than just rulemaking. That's an important step forward, although it won't fix all of the problems in Section 4 of the existing law. The draft would also ensure that EPA's determinations of unreasonable risk under Section 7 of current law will be made without consideration of costs and without explicit protections for vulnerable populations. EPA would then be able to move forward with risk management without the paralyzing requirement to select the least burdensome option. These two are essential steps forward, although issues in Section 6 still remain. Additionally, the draft would remove outdated limits on user fees to provide more resources for EPA's activities under TSCA, although it could do more to ensure that EPA actually receives those funds. The draft would also direct EPA to update the TSCA inventory, providing better information to consumers and policymakers on the universe of chemicals in commerce in the United States. And the draft would require substantiation of CBI claims in the future, preventing abuse of CBI claims and ensuring greater transparency. These are all positive changes that would empower EPA to offer greater protections for human health and the environment. And importantly, the draft also avoids some of the significant concerns that have been raised about past proposals, such as limits on the ability of EPA to regulate articles and limits on the ability of states to be partners in enforcement. So this bill reflects robust bipartisan outreach, which I hope to continue in the coming weeks. Mr. Chairman, you deserve credit for a strong process so far and a strong product. Some important issues remain to be worked out, such as setting yearly targets for EPA-initiated risk evaluations, ensuring that private rights of action are protected, and targeting risks from the worst of the worst chemicals, PBTs. So I hope we can come together to strengthen this proposal and produce a law. I welcome the testimony from today's witnesses, which will point the way for further work on a bipartisan basis. We've all, Mr. Shimkus, myself, Mr. Tonka, and of course Mr. Upton too, have been all, we really consider this a goal that can be accomplished on a bipartisan basis, and I just want to thank everyone for all their hard work, particularly over the last 2 weeks. You know, we had a recess for 2 weeks, but the staff were certainly not in recess. They were working very hard on this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I also want to thank you for your personal involvement, and we were working. There was a conference call for about an hour, and I think you were on the road somewhere, and I was on the road somewhere, and staff was here, and it was a good start. So people were working hard, and I appreciate it. Now I'd like to recognize myself. 5 minutes to start the questions. And Mr. Jones, how many chemicals already on the market is EPA currently assessing on a yearly basis? And I think, check the microphone. That's right.
Thank you. We identified about 80 chemicals several years ago for assessment. We have assessed final assessments for 5 of them, and we have about 20 under evaluation right now. So it's hard to, since we're so early in the early days of attempting to evaluate existing chemicals, it's hard to right now estimate exactly how many per year we're doing. Somewhere in the range between 3 and 8, I would say, would be an accurate number.
To evaluate, let's say, 20 chemicals per year, how much money and staff would you need? Do you have a
I would
idea?
think we would need at least twice the existing chemical resources we have right now to do 20 a year.
Would the discussion draft, particularly the section you kind of highlighted part of this in your testimony, requiring and manufacturers to pay all costs related to the requested reviews, allow you, the EPA, to have more chemicals evaluated?
Yeah, one of the tricks that we've observed in the way the bill is drafted is that those resources actually don't come to EPA, and so they go to the Treasury, and so we're limited by the appropriated resources that we have, so it doesn't really expand our capacity.
Is there, and that's why we have the hearing and stuff, because I'm being whispered in my ear that you're right. So we obviously that the intent is for, if there are user fees, the whole intent is for you to be able to get access to it so you can have the ability. And so if there's ways that you get your smart people involved and we get our smart people involved, maybe there's, I don't know what we can do, but we need to make sure that that happens. I think that's the intent. What's that, Mr. Chairman? I know I'm not the smart guy, so. Does the discussion draft improve the agency's ability to require the submission of hazard and exposure data by authorizing EPA to obtain it by rule, consent agreement, or by issuing an order?
Yes, it does.
Does a discussion draft allow EPA to select and do risk evaluations on chemicals whose exposures and hazards have the potential to be high enough to create an unreasonable risk?
Well, it's interesting because the language it creates an additional step that we don't have today, and that we have to. That's why I refer to as the potential catch-22. We actually have to make a finding before we can initiate a review, and that finding is somewhat related to risk, even though the whole point of a risk evaluation is to determine the risk. So it creates somewhat of a barrier, actually, to initiating a risk evaluation.
And then, obviously, the intent of the legislation is to be, as was stated in some of the opening statements, a more slimmed down, more efficient, a more simplistic process of getting from A to B to C to judgment ruling. So we want to make sure that we have that, and any help you can provide in addressing that, we would be, because you look at schematics of current law, and you look at schematics of other possible laws, they are much more complex, and we would like to, our intent is not to be, our intent is just to get the job done.
Right. I think that could be achieved.
The discussion draft excludes cost considerations when EPA performs risk evaluation, saving that issue for when and if a risk management rule is written. Do you agree that the risk evaluation should focus on hazard and exposure?
Yes.
You testified that the discussion draft is ambiguous on how EPA is to incorporate cost and other factors into a risk management rule under Section 6A. Can you explain why you said that?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's probably one of the most important observations that we have around the discussion draft. So the existing standard of unreasonable risk has been interpreted by courts to be a risk-benefit balancing, where the agency's actually got to demonstrate that the health benefits of the rule literally outweigh the costs imposed by the rule. It is not clear whether or not that interpretation that exists right now would be changed at all. There's some parts of the draft that make it appear that actually costs shouldn't come into consideration in determining the level of protection achieved, but that would conflict with the cost-benefit balancing that previous courts have determined. And then there's the cost-effectiveness language. And so what our observation is it's not clear if this discussion draft is maintaining the existing cost-benefit balancing, if it's attempting to exclude costs completely from the risk management, or if it wants costs considered but in some general way without being explicit. I think so. It's a clarity issue from our perspective.
Thank you, and my time's expired, but I think you've raised an issue that what is the, you have courts, decisions courts have rendered, and then again, simplistically, we're changing a law. So my guess is the courts would then have to render judgment under new statutes versus old statutes. So having said that, I'll recognize the ranking member, Ms. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, much exchange here has cited the hard work done over the last couple of weeks. So allow me to further compliment and thank the staff for their devotion to this effort, along with my colleagues. We need TSCA reform, certainly, because under current law, the American public is exposed to industrial chemicals without that sufficient bit of safeguard to protect public health. So tens of thousands of chemicals in commerce have never been tested for safety, and EPA does not currently have the necessary authority or resources to tackle this backlog. So, Mr. Jones, what is EPA currently doing to address the highest priority chemicals under TSCA?
Thank you, Congressman Tonko. So we identified, we evaluated the 1,200 or so chemicals with known hazard, and we compared them against criteria that were related to severity of hazard as well as the potential for exposure. And from that priority setting process, we've identified a little over 80 chemicals that we think are the most important to assess first, and we've now begun to assess those chemicals.
And then would this draft, as it currently stands, enable that work plan?
It sets a little bit of a higher bar than the priority process that we did in making a judgment that there's actually the potential for the exposure to exceed the hazard, which we did not do in our priority.
any clarification that we need to have in the language that we're proposing?
I think if we don't want to create a potential unmanageable bar, I think if that might be useful.
Okay. The last thing we should do is, in TSCA legislation, is make it harder for EPA to act against the worst chemicals. What changes could we make to ensure that the chemicals EPA thinks are the highest priority get reviewed and addressed?
Well, as I mentioned, having a requirement that we make a finding that the exposure may exceed the risk before we've actually done the risk assessment is I think an unnecessary requirement up front. And then as I mentioned earlier, I think it's important that we all have a clear understanding of what the actual risk management standard is. And I don't think it's clear right now what that standard is, which opens the potential for there to be a lot of litigation after decisions are made.
Yeah. And adding a minimum number for EPA is a beneficial thing when it comes to initiating reviews?
If the Congress wants a certain pace to be achieved, then my experience is that being clear about what your expectations are about how quickly the agency acts is pretty important.
Well, let me focus on the role of cost considerations that the chair was quizzing you about, and that using those costs in the effort to assess and manage risks. This bill includes, as he indicated, explicit language to indicate EPA's risk evaluation cannot take costs into consideration. The language is intended to ensure that EPA's determination of whether or not a chemical presents an unreasonable risk does not include cost considerations. But cost analyses are never part of that risk. They are, however, or should be included in an analysis of the options available to reduce identified risks for risk management. So are there, and again, heard the give and take, the bantering that you and the chair had, but are there suggested changes that you can share that would make that effort more clear?
Yeah, I think that and this goes back to the risk management standard Congress is trying to put into place. So the administration believes that costs are an important consideration in risk management, which is different from saying that the risk management standard should be a risk-benefit balancing. As I've testified before, in the chemicals arena, that's a very challenging thing to do because the risks that we're looking at are often not quantifiable, but the costs almost always are. And what we got out of the corrosion-proof case was a finding that the agency had numerically determined that those benefits literally numerically were larger than the costs, which creates you end up with a cost-biased standard, which has been one of the problems that we have had. Being clear about whether the Congress is looking for a cost-benefit balancing or you want a standard that requires the consideration of costs, which may not sound like it's a lot different, but actually in reality it's quite different, would be very useful.
Well, I think any kind of, suggested changes would be very helpful for the subcommittee as we move forward. And I appreciate your input here today. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes Vice Chair, Mr. Harper, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jones, thank you for being here today and shedding some light on a very important subject for us, and we look forward to working together on both sides of the aisle and with you on coming up with a solution that works, and appreciate your input on the discussion draft today. You testified that priority chemicals should be assessed and acted upon in a timely manner if the chemical poses a risk. For your work planned chemicals, have you determined that some show an unreasonable risk?
So we have demonstrated of the 5 assessments we've completed that 3 of them demonstrate risk. 2 of them we said were not significant risks. But unreasonable risk under current TSCA has been interpreted by courts to mean that the health benefits outweigh the costs. And so what we're doing right now for the 3 chemicals where we've demonstrated significant risks, we're evaluating the health benefits that we've identified and comparing them to the cost of potential regulation. And ultimately, we need to come up with risk management that balances the health benefits with the cost. So that's the part of the process that we're in right now.
So the 3 of the 5 that you're moving forward on, you haven't completed that process.
That's correct.
Correct.
We're in that process.
So what is the status of the risk management rules on those particular 3 chemicals?
So we are right now, we've articulated the health benefits, the risk, and we are right now evaluating the cost of potential regulation, which also involves looking at evaluating the risks and the benefits of the alternatives and determining whether or not we have figured out the least burdensome way to adequately protect against the risk.
You know, when you have those 5 that you were looking at, ruling out 2 of those, did you start the process on all 5 at the same time?
Yes, we did.
Okay. And are they supposed to proceed at the same pace, or I assume each one can be at a different level, but are you proceeding at are the 3 that you're looking at, are they the same spot in the process?
They are actually, although that's a little bit by happenstance, because sometimes you run into a difficult issue and it may take a little longer to resolve. But the 3 that we are looking at, whether or not there is unreasonable risk, they're moving at pretty much the same pace.
Now, you said there are 80 that have been identified,
That's correct. 83.
and how many? Who determines which ones are looked at next and assessed?
That would be me.
order?
No, so
Okay.
we actually had a public process where we identified factors
Yes.
that we wanted to look at. They were factors like carcinogenicity, reproductive toxicity, persistence, bioaccumulation, and we also wanted to make sure there was exposure so that we weren't looking at potentially hazardous chemicals for which nobody was being exposed. We had public participation around that, had some workshops, and then we finalized the criteria, and then we evaluated about 1,200 chemicals against the criteria that we developed, and these are the ones that came out on top.
So how many assessments do you believe will be completed this calendar year?
That's a tricky one because we're taking on some, there are at least 3 that will be above the 5 that we've done that it's very clear will be completed. We're also looking at some of the most challenging compounds, which are flame retardants, and we're looking at several dozen of those, and they're quite complicated. So it's hard for me at this point to predict how many of the flame retardant assessments we'll complete.
Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The testimony we hear today will be essential as we work to move this draft forward. And I know we've heard already today, and we'll continue to hear from the second panel, that there are a number of changes needed to the draft, and I appreciate my colleague, Mr. Tonko, for highlighting some of those changes. I'd like to focus briefly on some of the things I think this draft gets right, and if you can, to just answer yes or no, but I'm not going to restrict you completely. I just want to get through it. First, I'd like to highlight some of the problems in current law that I think this draft addresses. So, Mr. Jones, does this draft remove the least burdensome language that has been an obstacle to EPA action under Section 6?
Yes.
Does the draft remove the statutory cap on user fees in existing law?
Yes.
Is it your view that the draft needs to do more to ensure that EPA actually receives adequate resources to carry out this program?
Yes, and I would just say it's because the draft as it's written right now does not allow the fees to come to EPA.
Okay. Would you have any recommendation in that regard?
We could work with the committee to figure out how to write that. We've done that before.
Okay. Well, I just hope that we can make changes to ensure that EPA has the resources as we move forward. Otherwise, what good is it? Turning back to the draft, does this draft require justification of future CBI claims, unlike current law?
Yes.
And does this draft provide explicit protections for vulnerable populations and therefore improve current law?
It's a little ambiguous. It precludes EPA from determining a chemical meets the safety standard unless we have evaluated vulnerable populations, but doesn't then speak to scenarios where we find that the safety standard is not met.
Okay. I think these are all very important points, and I recognize that the draft is not as comprehensive as some past proposals, but I think it would move the ball forward on chemical regulation and improve current law. I also wanted to recognize again the subcommittee chairman, Mr. Shimkus, because he's tried to avoid some of the major issues that have stalled proposals in the Senate. So let me ask you about some of that. Mr. Jones, I know that you raised concerns about article provisions in the Senate bill. Are those concerns addressed here?
Yes, they are.
Okay. And you also raised some concerns about the ability of states to co-enforce requirements of EPA TSCA rules and to regulate chemicals while EPA is evaluating them. Are those concerns addressed here?
Yes.
Okay. I think it's, again, I think this draft is a good starting point. Obviously, we still have a lot of work to do, but we have had a very good process so far, and I look forward to continuing to work with the chairman and Mr. Tonka. And so at this point, I can't believe I'm actually yielding back, but I accomplished everything I wanted to accomplish unless
Here's my
somebody...
short answers.
All right, thank you.
Gentleman yields back his time, and I hope those answers are helpful to you, and maybe hope they're not harmful to me. So, so with that, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks very much for holding this very important hearing today. And Administrator, thanks for being with us today. Last year, when you testified before the subcommittee in April, in fact, it was about a year, I discussed with you the TSCA inventory. You stated how the actual number of chemicals on the TSCA inventory would fall somewhere between 7,000 and 84,000. The 7,000 number being the rough number of chemicals produced in large quantities, and overall the 84,000 representing those chemicals that have been on the inventory and how it could be potentially misleading. Let me ask, do you believe that in the discussion draft before us would give a more accurate picture of the chemicals actually in commerce on any given date?
It would, yes.
Okay. And also, let me ask, also in the, how effective do you believe the least burdensome provision has been under the current law?
I think it's created a barrier under the current law.
Okay, could you explain that, how it's created a barrier?
So, for example, right now there are 3 chemicals that we've identified as posing significant risk, and before we can move forward regulating them, we have to evaluate about 8 different risk management scenarios that are identified in the statute and show how for each one of them we are selecting the one that poses the least burden on the society at large. So we have to analyze each of these potential risk management options and then just pick the least burdensome one, which is a general matter I don't have a problem with, but it's not always necessary to evaluate everything to know which one is going to be the least burdensome ultimately, and yet we're required to do that under the statute.
Let me ask, how much time does that add to the process?
Well, we're doing it right now for the first time in 30 years, and so I'll have a clearer answer when we've actually finished that analysis, and whether or not a court ultimately upholds, did we do enough analysis for each of the risk management options that are in the statute.
Okay. Let me ask about, under the proposed draft bill before us, is on the deadlines. And, on the deadlines, we're looking at that the administration shall conduct and publish a risk evaluation under the subsection for a chemical substance for not later than 3 years after the date on the administrator makes a finding, 180 days after the date on which the manufacturer requests the risk evaluation. And it also goes on to state that if the administrator determines that additional information is necessary to make a risk evaluation determination in the subsection, it can be extended to a date of 90 days after the receipt of the additional information or 2 years after the original deadline. And with that, where do you see that? Do you see that would be a good time frame?
I think deadlines are really important for the government to have, but they're pretty short. And the only one that I think that the agency has some potential for meeting is the initial assessment if EPA initiates the review. 3 years. Our experience so far is that between 2 and 3 years, so having the deadline be the latter end of it seems appropriate. Us turning an assessment around in 6 months from an industry submitted submission, I think, is unrealistically optimistic. I would love to be able to do proposed rules within 6 months of a safety evaluation. My experience is that is also just unrealistic from past experience.
Well, with the 3 years, how long on general, you're saying 2 to 3, but how many different chemicals are out there that have taken more than 3 years for you to do an evaluation on?
So, it's possible that something that's hugely challenging an exposure potential, or hugely challenging from understanding the hazard, that it would take longer than 3 years. I would expect that as a general matter, 3 years is a deadline that could be achieved for the vast majority of the chemicals we'd evaluate.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And
If
Mr.
the gentleman, you last 44 seconds.
I'll go back.
Under the industry applied evaluation, you'll have more data in that process than when you just pick a chemical out of the air and say, we have to do this one as a requirement under current law. Is that correct?
It's not clear that that would be the case. I assume that that was some of the assumptions that were built into that 6-month deadline. It is not obvious the way it's drafted that we would have more. The other
Well, if the industry is willing to have you expedite this, my guess is that there be, a working relationship but we will work to clear that up. My assumption would be they're going to give you what they have to try to get an expedited. I mean, that's the whole benefit of going through this process is coming to a decision.
yeah, the draft is written that all they have to do is request it, so they don't
Okay.
have to actually give us anything.
Okay. Thank you. I thank my colleague. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Schrader, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. How does the agency currently, and then under your interpretation of the new discussion draft, balance individual risk and responsibility versus, absolute risk, if you will, posed by certain chemicals?
That's a good question, Congressman. Right now, we're looking at a compound that is used as a paint stripper, and it has actually resulted in deaths across the country over the last 15 years. And so, arguably, and it results in deaths because people sometimes use it in closed space. And so, it's theoretically possible that we could mitigate that risk by a labeling restriction, although when you look, there actually is a labeling restriction right now, although the fine print's quite fine. And so you try to struggle with the effectiveness of giving people information to protect themselves versus what maybe the reality is to whether or not people avail themselves of that. And so it is something that we right now are struggling with a chemical that we have made a priority compound, because the individuals do have some responsibility with respect to protecting themselves, but at the same time, if past is prologue, and giving information may not be effective, we think that we have the ability to protect people for themselves. So.
And I think one of the struggles this committee is going to have, and the Congress writ large, is balancing that personal responsibility. There are people that are allergic to certain things that most people are not allergic to, and does that make that a toxic substance, generally speaking? So I think we're going to have a lot of work to do to find out what that appropriate balance is. This is still the United States of America, and people do bear personal responsibility for their own health and well-being, and labeling, albeit small or large, hopefully adequately, demonstrating what potential harm it may cause to a certain subpopulation is important. But the real world is anything in excess is probably toxic, in popular terms, carcinogenic. Everything's carcinogenic these days. I think we have to be thoughtful, and would hope the EPA would balance their rulemaking with whatever legislation we have going forward. I'm interested in the cost-effectiveness discussion. You're interested in apparently even more leeway than is now granted under this legislation. I'd probably be against that. My concern is that cost should be taken into account. We have a Superfund site in my state where EPA's interpretation has gotten to where if one individual sort of maybe could have ingested a certain amount of fish on a daily basis, way in excess of what any person would do, even tribal members, that at a level that's way below the current toxicity standards, that would pose a significant risk and needs to be mitigated by extremely expensive alternatives. And the judgment I've seen so far from EPA is that they want to have a very expensive alternative to what could be a simpler solution to, I think, a very exaggerated risk. So I would hope that you would, take this into account, and I hope that the legislation does not reduce the cost effectiveness. To me, it seems pretty clear. When you're determining the risk, okay, cost should not perhaps be part of the discussion, but certainly, absolutely, 100%, cost effectiveness should be part of, a major part of, the solution. And I would fight against any language that said costs should be just a consideration. That, to your point, is a loophole you could drive a truck through at the end of the day. So I'd hope you'd be at least open to the current legislation as currently written.
Yeah, we think it's very important for cost to be considered in the risk management. It's about how it should be considered. And as I was saying, right now it's not clear if it needs to be considered in a literal balancing of costs and benefits. And that we have stated numerous times how challenging that is for chemicals, where it's always possible to estimate costs. It's often not possible to give a numeric monetization to the benefits.
Well, if you can't monetize it, that what can't be measured should probably be done. I mean, at the end of the day, there has to be, everyone is susceptible. There's going to be some person, some individual, some child, some remote genetic configuration of any given individual that's going to be at risk with any given chemical or food substance, whether it's deemed safe or not. And I think it's extremely important not to get wrapped around the axle on having completely irrelevant, with all due respect, solutions that are not actually beneficial to the population writ large. As a veterinarian, it's all about epidemiology. You're not going to save everybody at the end of the day, and we have to understand that. And I think America in this 21st century has to become sophisticated enough to understand where is the maximum risk exposure. With that, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to the chairman of the committee, or ranking member, excuse me.
Yeah, you don't want to give it to me. No, you might want to give it to me.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Yielding. I would like to turn briefly to a concern I have that the draft is too specific about how the agency should conduct science. Agency decisions must be transparent, including those about science, but in my opinion, these are decisions best left to technical experts. This draft includes requirements that EPA act based on a specific definition of the weight of the scientific evidence. It requires EPA to consider a lengthy list of factors, including sponsor organizations, uncertainty, and more. So, Mr. Jones, when these scientific requirements are included in the statute, does that open EPA's use of science up to litigation?
So any requirement that you have to do, you then either, if you don't do it, you're open to litigation. I think that the science requirement that most troubles us is the consideration of a threshold effect, which is something that we do right now, but it's certainly possible that in 10, 15, or 20 years, it's not even part of the scientific, lexicon. And so boxing us into things that may become obsolete in the future scientifically are the kinds of things we'd like to generally avoid.
Well, thank you. I share those concerns, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for five
Thank you,
minutes.
Mr. Chairman. Administrator Jones, about a year ago, you testified before this committee on TSCA reform. You may remember at that meeting I expressed my concern to you that TSCA reporting requirements seem to incentivize manufacturers, for example, in the electronics industry, to landfill byproducts instead of recycling them, even when those byproducts are rich in recyclable metals and other valuable materials, copper, for example. In other words, we're making it more cost-effective for manufacturers to put that stuff in the dirt than to recycle it, save money, create jobs, and be more environmentally conscious. You may also remember that last October I sent Administrator McCarthy a letter asking the EPA to complete its analysis of data collected during the 2012 chemical data reporting, or the CDR cycle, with the idea that such an analysis would help EPA reassess the need for CDR information in future reporting cycles. In December, I received a response from Administrator McCarthy that the analysis would be completed by early 2015. It's now April, and no analysis has been finalized. And while the EPA has had talks with my staff, and I know that there's been some exchange of information with industry, it has not provided the electronics industry nor the public with any new information for some time now. So because it appears that this analysis is ongoing, I remain hopeful that the EPA still has the opportunity to safely incentivize the recycling of byproducts and render any other options to solve this problem unnecessary. But the first step must be the release of the analysis of the 2012 CDR of byproducts. Can you tell me when that data will be released?
Thanks, Congressman, and thank you for raising this issue to our attention. We have spent a fair amount of time evaluating the issue that you brought to our attention. We have begun to communicate with your staff as well as the electronics industry the results of our analysis. I would be reluctant to give a date on the release of the analysis before checking with my staff, but we are very close to being able to give an answer to the question that you raised.
Okay, well, Administrator McCarthy said early 2015. Is that still a projection? Are we looking at the first half of this year?
It's the first half of this year. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, I look forward to getting that. I appreciate that. What is the EPA's cost for doing the analysis that they do? Is it pretty consistent, or does the cost vary from chemical to chemical?
It's going to vary pretty significantly from chemical to chemical.
Okay, can you give us an example?
Yep. So the first 5 chemicals that we looked at, we project that the regulation for those that we think bear consideration of regulation will cost about $1.5 million, and the analysis will have been $1 million. That applies to 3 of them, and so the chemicals that demonstrated some risk are significantly more expensive to do than the 2 chemicals which did not demonstrate any risk. So when you find no risk, it's relatively cheap. There we estimated about $1 million. So actually much of the cost is associated with the regulatory requirements of the analysis necessary to support a regulation.
You just said something that maybe I misunderstood you. Why would you be considering regulating a chemical that provides no risk anyway?
I'm sorry, I must have stated it backwards. The chemicals that demonstrated risk are the ones that we're doing regulatory analysis for to support a potential regulation.
Okay, all right. The discussion draft gives the EPA the authority to select a chemical substance for risk evaluation under TSCA Section 6. Would the EPA rely on information that is currently available to the agency to make those selections?
That is how we would intend to
That's how you put those in the risk categories?
Yes.
Okay. I think I've only got 34 seconds left, and I can't get this last one in. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back some of my time.
Gentleman
Thank you.
yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
I'm sitting in as the ranking member. Mr. Tonko had to go, although Paul from New York really doesn't want me from Texas doing it. But I want to.
We better take down that placard, so you might hurt him.
Oh.
So.
Yeah, I don't want to get him in trouble. Thank you for being here, but I particularly want to thank Chairman Shimkus and Ranking Member Tonko and our ranking member and chair of the full committee for working on this issue. It's been frustrating because of a law that's been since 1976, and I know for the last 2 terms, this subcommittee's tried to see how we could deal with it. But it sounds like, we'll go small and see what we can do and do just problem solving, which I think is a great way to go. If enacted with the TSCA Modernization Act, improve EPA's ability to make a risk determination and a risk management plan for existing chemicals?
That's an interesting question. For the way it's structured right now, because the way the fees don't come to the agency, for industry submitted requests, it would absolutely make it clearer what we had to do and how many. We have to do whatever they submitted to us. But because we're not getting the fees, I think it would crowd out our ability to initiate any on our own. Now, if there's a solution that allows the fees to come to EPA, then I think it would clearly allow us to have more pace to our existing chemicals program.
Okay. Would the discussion draft retain the current TSCA timing of preemption of state and local action?
Basically, yeah. It would retain the. It would eliminate the. It would basically be similar to what's currently required in TSCA, marginally different.
Under the discussion draft, would risk determination be based solely on health and safety factors without consideration of cost?
The risk evaluation would, yes.
Okay. Currently, the EPA is allowed to disclose confidential business information to state and local government officials. Is that part of this package?
Currently, it's quite difficult to do that, but under this provision, the provision in the discussion draft, it would make it quite straightforward to do that.
Okay. Discussion draft allow EPA to disclose the confidential business information to strike that. Under current TSCA, is EPA allowed to disclose CBI to a treating doctor or healthcare professional?
It's quite, that's what I was saying a second ago, it's quite burdensome for us to do that right now, which is something that's discussed.
Would this discussion draft help with that?
Yes, it would.
Okay. Would discussion draft authorize EPA to disclose, well, I take that back again. Under current law, there is any limit, is there any limit to the length of time for a confidential business information claim?
No.
Under the discussion draft, would there be any time limits?
Yes, 10 years.
Okay. Discussion draft creates a new term, potentially exposed subpopulations. Under the definition provided in the discussion draft with the thousands of chemical plant that I have and the people who work there and the people who live around it in our district be covered under the definition of potentially exposed subpopulation?
It's certainly possible that they would be, yes.
Okay. Now, obviously, we want those jobs there, but we also want to make sure it's what the products they're producing that our country needs is as safe as possible. In your testimony, you noted the discussion draft lacks a sustained source of funding for the chemical safety management, which goes back to the funding. Would you recommend to our subcommittee the best way to address that concern?
I think it's a relatively straightforward fix that has the funding that's designated here going to the EPA, which right now would not go to the EPA.
And I think that's something we'll consider. Are there current statutes that provide sustained source of funding that could be used as a model for TSCA reform?
Yeah, both the drug law, PDUFA is the acronym, or the pesticide law, the Pesticide Registration Improvement Act, both have funding mechanisms.
Okay. You stated in your testimony the EPA strongly feels that any update to TSCA must provide the agency with the ability to make timely decisions and the ability to take action to address that risk. Do you believe that the discussion draft provides the agency with the needed authority to make those timely decisions?
The timeliness is clear. As I said earlier, I think that the ambition is quite impressive and perhaps not manageable. I think the part that I'm struggling with is looking for more clarity as to exactly what the risk management standard is, so we're not fighting in litigation forever about what it actually means.
And I agree. I would hope that when we finish that we give the clarity that you need so there's no question at all. You know, in fact, EPA's downstairs in the Energy and the Power Subcommittee, so you are a regular guest here at in our committee.
We carpooled over.
Yeah, but any suggestions, I know we would all appreciate that on how. And do you believe that discussion draft gives EPA the authority to address the identified risks? If not, what changes would we need to ensure the agency has that authority?
And again, that goes back to clarity of what the risk management standard is important.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know I'm over time. I appreciate it.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now will look to my colleague from Indiana, Mr. Bouchon. Do you waive? Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette. It's good to have her back. It's very active last Congress, and we're glad to see her here with us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate you having this hearing, but even more so, I appreciate the amount you've worked with Mr. Green, myself, Mr. Tonko, and others on really trying to make progress on this path to TSCA reform. It's not easy, as we all have been saying. If it was easy, it wouldn't have taken us 30 years to fix it. So I just have it, and thank you, Assistant Administrator Jones, for coming over to give us some thoughts this morning. I want to start by looking at EPA's ability to require testing of chemicals under the draft. This discussion draft includes an important change to EPA's authority under Section 4 of TSCA by empowering the EPA to require testing through order rather than rulemaking. So if you can talk to us about how order authority will improve your ability to require testing under Section 4, that would be great.
Sure. Right now, we're required to do a rule if we want to compel the generation of health and safety data for a chemical, and we're also required to make a finding that we have some reason to believe there may be an unreasonable adverse effect for such chemicals. So you get into this kind of a catch-22. You want the data because you don't know, but you need to know something before you compel it. And then you have to do a rule, and rulemaking is a very long process, and so it can take many, many years. And so an order authority would allow us to move much more quickly to require generation of health and safety data.
Do you have any sense about, on an average, how much more quickly that would be?
Well, in our pesticides program, we have order authority and have had it for 40 years. And when we find that there's data that we need to require, we are able to issue orders in matters of months as opposed to 4 or 5 years.
Okay. Now that change was one that I had sought in Section 4, but this draft doesn't seem to address the catch-22 that EPA has long faced, because, and you talk a little about it, it seems that under this draft, the EPA would still have to find that a chemical might present an unreasonable risk before they were required, before they could require testing, and that's what you were just talking about.
So the way we've read the discussion draft, Congresswoman, is that to issue an order, we don't need to make that finding. So
Okay.
that seems to be addressed. It's in the context of to initiate a risk evaluation. We need to have some reason to believe the exposure exceeds the hazards.
And so how do you think the language, or do you think the language can be adjusted in this discussion draft to reflect that issue?
I think it would be relatively straightforward to do that. Instead of having some reason to believe the exposure exceeds hazard, have some reason to believe there is exposure, have some reason to believe there is hazard.
Okay, so it's the exceeds hazard that's
Yep.
the issue.
I think so.
If you could work with us to supplement your response to give us some technical assistance on that, that would be really
happy to.
helpful. We'd appreciate it. In addition to granting the EPA order authority to require testing, the discussion draft also includes a provision to allow manufacturers to request that EPA evaluate their chemicals for safety. The discussion draft requires EPA to make a finding on any evaluations requested by companies within 6 months. Is that going to be enough time to perform a robust evaluation of a chemical?
I don't think so, no.
How long does the evaluation of a chemical usually take?
It usually takes a couple of years, and this was the conversation that
Right.
the chairman and I were having, that the discussion draft doesn't require the manufacturers to submit all the data necessary to do an evaluation. If it did, it would still require a couple of years, and so they could just say, I want you to evaluate my chemical. The other thing is that when there's a controversy around the chemical, it's often the case that EPA's interpretation of the data doesn't agree with the manufacturer.
So do you think there's some language we could put together to tighten that up a little bit?
It would seem like it's more about how much time the agency should have
Okay,
to do
so
it.
maybe, Mr. Chairman, that's something we can talk about as we go forward.
Would generally yield?
Be happy.
I still think there's this debate about what is the industry going to provide, and that was the whole
Right,
part. If
right.
they're providing a lot of data, then the timelines may be legit. So we'll
Right.
visit on
Okay,
that.
good, all right. The last thing is that the discussion draft proposes amending Section 9 of TSCA to allow the EPA to set fees to help defray the costs of additional chemical testing, but it doesn't flag funds to be used specifically for that purpose. So my question is, does the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention have sufficient funds appropriated to undertake additional testing of new chemicals under TSCA?
Not as written in the discussion draft.
So if we had some kind of a dedicated fund, rather than just solely relying on appropriations, would that be of assistance?
Yes, it would.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Generally, time's expired. Chair now turns to Mr. Kramer from North Dakota for 5 minutes. Do you waive? The gentleman is yielded to Mr. Hudson. Is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today. Appreciate your testimony. It's been very informative. My first question, TSCA, as amended by the discussion draft, requires that the agency have a need for testing and exposure information before it imposes a requirement on manufacturers and processors to develop that information. Is that a good requirement?
I believe so, yeah.
Right. Last year, you asked that each chemical evaluation have a deadline for completion. Are the deadlines in our bill about right for that?
I rarely say this, they're a little too short.
Really? What do you think they ought to be?
Well, I think that we can complete assessments within 3 years. I don't think we can, even with industry-submitted data, complete an industry-submitted assessment in 6 months. As much as I would love to do a rulemaking in 6 months, I think we probably need upwards of 2 years to do a rulemaking.
Okay. EPA has authorized some 90 chemicals as TSCA work plan chemicals. Does the discussion draft require a change to that program?
It requires us to make a finding that's above and beyond what we did in the identification of the priority chemicals.
Okay. Well, would work plan chemicals likely be selected for risk evaluations under the House discussion draft?
They would likely be, but again, we'd have to do one additional step that we have not done heretofore. Make a determination that we think it's likely or possible that the exposure exceeds the hazard, which we've not done.
Gotcha. I've got a question as far as fees, collection fees. Currently, how does the agency currently collect user fees under TSCA?
We only have a fee right now for the submission of a new chemical under the pre-manufacturer notification program. Those fees don't come to EPA either. Except for some small businesses, a manufacturer, when they submit a new chemical to EPA for review, submits a fee with that.
Okay. And those go back to the Treasury?
They go back to the Treasury.
What's your budget breakdown by category for individual sections of TSCA?
That, I would need to get back to you on that, but we could provide that pretty quickly.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it if you would do that. What is the EPA budget in both funding and FTEs for chemical review under Section 5 and under Section 6 of TSCA?
Again, that would be part of what we would get back to you on overall budget breakdown between existing chemicals, new chemicals.
Okay, well, I'd appreciate that information. Thank you, and Mr.
Gentleman yield.
I yield back to the chairman.
Just a follow-up. So on new chemicals, you have 90 days, and then with the possibility of additional 90 days.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're saying on existing chemicals, it'll take 3 years. That's just part of the debate that we're having.
Yep.
You'll have to explain to me why, not now, but you'll have to explain to me why that is. And with that, I yield back the time, and now she's been very patient. My colleague from California, Ms. Capps, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, for holding the hearing, and our witness for your testimony. Under current law, TSCA has used an unreasonable risk, quote, standard to evaluate the safety of a chemical. This is understood to be a cost-benefit standard, which in effect requires the agency to balance the economic value of a chemical against the adverse health effects, such as cancer, autism. Besides posing serious ethical problems, this approach has also proven to be unworkable. Mr. Jones, what's the impact of this cost-benefit standard in the context of TSCA?
Well, it was, well, as I've mentioned, that it's often very difficult for certain health outcomes to, the way in which we do risk assessment, to monetize them. Some we are able to. There are some carcinogens which we are able to monetize. There are some pollutants like particulate matter where we're able to monetize. In the case of a chemical that we're looking at right now where death is the outcome, we can monetize that. There are some outcomes, the way our risk assessment is designed, we are not able to monetize them. And so our ability to say that these benefits literally outweigh these costs is challenging. It's not impossible, but it creates a challenge for us.
Since 2009, there has been widespread agreement that this cost-benefit standard does need to be abandoned. This subcommittee has repeatedly received testimony that TSCA's current safety standard is failing to protect the general public and particularly vulnerable populations. EPA, the American Chemistry Council, even oil refineries have all stated that costs should not be part of safety determinations under TSCA. I welcome the changes in the discussion draft to explicitly exclude costs from risk evaluations, but I'm not sure they go far enough. So my question, Mr. Jones, is do you think changes are needed in this draft to ensure the safety of chemicals is evaluated against a purely health standard?
Well, what I've said so far today is that right now it's just ambiguous as to
Right.
what the standard is, and that I think is critically important so we don't spend, if this were to become law, the next 30 years litigating what the standard is. The administration has said that the safety evaluation should be risk-based, but the administration's also said that cost should be a consideration in the risk management.
Right. I hope you'll work with this committee because we intend to, I hope, and move forward to ensure the language gives effect to that kind of intent. Another important component of the safety standard in any TSCA proposal is protection for vulnerable populations. Vulnerable populations include infants and children, the elderly and disabled, workers, and those living near chemical facilities. In their 2009 report, Science and Decisions, the National Academy of Science recommended that vulnerable populations should receive special attention at all stages of the risk assessment process. Mr. Jones, do you agree that it is important to address risks to vulnerable populations when managing chemical risks
Yes.
under TSCA? I'm pleased to see this draft includes an explicit protection for vulnerable populations, blocking EPA from finding that a chemical does not present an unreasonable risk if the agency finds that the chemical presents an unreasonable risk for a vulnerable subpopulation. In other words, if a chemical fails to meet the standard for a subpopulation, it doesn't meet the standard, period. Mr. Jones, do you think that requirement is going to provide the protection that we need for vulnerable populations?
It's interesting, Congresswoman Capps, that when we make the determination that a chemical doesn't pose an unreasonable risk, we have to make the finding you described. And this just goes back to the earlier comments about what the actual safety standard is, and we find that there is risk, is not clear, and for that reason, it's not clear how vulnerable populations would be included in that. So we find there is a risk.
So we need more clarity.
There needs more clarity there, yeah.
Yes. Oh, and I appreciate the efforts made in this draft to ensure, and I can see now it's important to emphasize the word draft, that it probably does need to be changed along the way. Costs are left out of safety evaluations and that vulnerable populations are protected. This is sort of, we are this far on it, but I hope we can continue to work to improve this draft. I applaud the efforts that we've made so far, but we have a ways to go to make sure that we move chemical regulation forward. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. Seeing no other members asking for questions, we want to thank you for, obviously, so not long in congressional time, but a legislative hearing, and we want to thank the members for being very diligent and involved and engaging in your responses. We look forward to working with you. And with that, we would dismiss you and ask for the second panel to come forward.
Thank you.
We'd like to get started. We want to thank the second panel for coming and appreciate you sitting through the first round. Hopefully a lot of questions will be generated based upon the comments. The way I'd like to do it is I'll just introduce one at a time when their time comes for the opening statements. And again, welcome a lot of our familiar faces that we've seen here numerous times. So friends of the committee, I would say. First, we'd like to welcome Mr. Mike Walls, who's the Vice President of Regulatory and Technical Affairs with the American Chemistry Council. Your full statement's into the record. You have 5 minutes, and you're recognized.
Good morning, Mr. Shimkus, Mr. Tonko, and members of the
And
subcommittee.
just if you could help, just pull that, a little bit closer.
A little bit closer. How's that? I don't want to break anybody's eardrums. Thank you again for the invitation to be here today. I'm very happy to testify today in support of the bipartisan discussion draft. ACC strongly supports efforts to reform TSCA. Over the years, problems with implementation of the current statute have eroded public confidence in the federal regulatory system, contributed to misperceptions about the safety of chemicals, and created uncertainty throughout interstate commerce. The discussion draft is a significant milestone in the TSCA reform debate. For the first time, there's now a bipartisan TSCA reform measures before each House of Congress. And while the debate over TSCA reform certainly doesn't end with this hearing, there's now a very real opportunity to achieve TSCA reform this year. And we at ACC are very encouraged by the very positive comments that members of this subcommittee have made, both on the process and the substance of the draft. Now, in 2009, ACC published a set of 10 fundamental principles for TSCA reform. The discussion draft, like S-697, which is pending in the Senate, fully addresses all our principles. The draft addresses key issues and shortcomings in TSCA. And among the most important elements are that the draft requires that EPA evaluate risks only on the basis of health and environmental considerations. That was a key problem that has hampered implementation of the current act to date. Under the draft, cost and benefit considerations are relevant only in deciding what regulatory option EPA will impose to control risks. We believe the draft strengthens EPA's authority to mandate the generation of new information on chemicals. The draft also protects sensitive commercial information from disclosure while requiring appropriate upfront substantiation of those claims. The draft also balances the interests of the state and federal governments by promoting a robust, uniform, national chemical regulatory system. As the subcommittee continues its discussion, some elements of the draft do require some additional clarifications. We think there's a need for additional detail and direction to EPA on the manufacturer risk-initiated the manufacturer-initiated risk evaluation process. I think you heard comments to that effect from Mr. Jones. We think it's particularly important that Congress provide clear direction and clearly articulate its expectations for that process. And at a minimum, EPA should be required to promulgate rules or appropriate guidance so that all stakeholders understand how that process can produce risk evaluations that are timely, of high quality, and are reliable. We also think it's necessary to clarify the interplay between sections 6A and 6B and the presence or absence of an appropriate risk management rule. This was one of the elements Mr. Jones mentioned at the conclusion of his testimony. ACC also believes that EPA must have access to appropriate resources to implement a reformed TSCA. Under the draft, TSCA fee revenue is deposited to the General Treasury. We believe those funds need to be returned to EPA. The draft also allows state governments to adopt regulations identical to those promulgated by EPA in certain cases. It would be helpful if the degree to which states may depart from the federal approach in enforcing those regulations, if at all, should be clarified. Again, the bipartisan discussion draft is a significant step toward achieving TSCA reform this year. We look forward to working with all members of this subcommittee to ensure that TSCA reform builds confidence in the U.S. chemical regulatory system, protects health and the environment from significant risks, and meets the commercial and competitive interests of the U.S. chemical industry and the national economy. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I'm happy to respond to questions.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to turn to Dr. Beth Bosley, President of Boron Specialties. On behalf of the Society of Chemical Manufacturers and Affiliates, you've testified before. Welcome back, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much. Good morning, Chairman Shimkus and Ranking Member Tonko and everyone on the subcommittee. And thanks also for having me back to Washington to discuss TSCA, one of my favorite subjects. It's been really refreshing to hear so much positive statements being put forth by both the Democrats and Republicans on this issue, and we really applaud all the efforts to modernize TSCA. It covers such a wide variety of chemicals and applications, and it really impacts a huge swath of our economy. So it's really important. And given the range of interested parties, it's remarkable how much alignment has been achieved. It's a very complicated statute, and you've worked pretty hard not to make it more complicated, so I applaud that as well. I'd just like to highlight a few things that I think are important in the discussion draft. The safety standard, I think it corrects, as we've already heard today, it corrects the fundamental flaw in the current TSCA that requires you to take cost into account. In this case, protection of human health and the environment is really the only driver for the safety standard, and that is a great improvement. EPA will make very different decisions under Section 6 now than it has before, and it will allow policy and emerging science to inform protective determinations regarding these chemicals. For new chemicals, I've talked quite a bit, I think, here before that I think the new chemicals process works very well, and I'd like it to remain basically as it is. It's one of the more important parts of the statute. It drives our environment, drives protection of our environment and our economy. Experience has taught us that new chemicals can be greener, and of course we must continue to innovate because we live in a global economy now. If we want to promote innovation and development of greener chemistries, we really must remain, Section 5 really must remain efficient, predictable, and affordable. We're also interested in timely access to the market, and the 90-day review window has proven sufficient in most cases. In some cases, EPA has to suspend or give itself another 90 days. But in fact, EPA often completes its review after day 22, which is really very early. It depends on how much information they're given, but after day 22 is often. We'd certainly like to be able to go to market after day 22 as well. One area that TSCA hasn't worked, and we've heard about this a number of times already this morning, is with existing chemicals, but I think the discussion graph goes a long way to really solve the problems with existing chemicals. It can ask for data under Section 4 really whenever it thinks it's necessary to conduct the risk evaluation. It doesn't have to make a finding, and that is a really great improvement. We do support a more comprehensive review of existing chemicals, and since there is no detailed screening process outlined in the bill, we're assuming EPA would go forward with its work plan chemicals as it has to date. We do also support deadlines for this review. I'm not sure how long it takes, but I would say EPA probably has a good estimate of how long existing chemicals take to review. And we know that deadlines work well in new chemicals, so they should work well in existing chemicals. But the deadlines and the workload really has to be achievable. Under Section 8 for the reporting requirements, one of the most important factors we see there is an inventory reset. As we've heard already today, again, there's over 80,000 chemicals on the inventory, but only 800 were reported on in the most recent CDR. That's a big disparity between what's in commerce and what's not in commerce. Currently, as a manufacturer also, I report on exposures of chemicals to my employees, but then I also have to estimate exposures to my customers' employees, and that's pretty hard for me to do, especially as a small business. So I would think processor reporting would be very important to add to this. Requiring processor reporting would be very important language to add. Confidential business information is really important for all U.S. manufacturers, but especially small businesses like mine. CBI allows us to pursue research and market development without advertising to the world exactly what we're doing. Even so, we really appreciate that we must proceed with as much transparency as possible, and I think the resubstantiation after 10 years is an excellent addition to the current draft. Resources and fees, as we've all heard, EPA needs more resources, and getting those fees to EPA instead of the Treasury is really important. I also appreciate, as you might imagine, that you've given the provision for small business reduced fees, and I wholeheartedly support that. So in general, just very much supportive of the bill, and we think it fixes a lot of the problems with the current TSCA statute, and I'm sure other issues will be raised, but we look forward to working through them with you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to recognize Ms. Jennifer Thomas, Director of Federal Government Affairs with the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers. Again, another returnee. Welcome, and you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Shimkus, Ranking Member Tonko. My name is Jennifer Thomas, and I am here on behalf of the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers, which is a trade association of 12 automakers. And together they account for approximately 75 to 80% of all new vehicle sales here in the U.S. The last time I was before this committee, I was beamed in from Europe, so I'm very happy to be here in person this time. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share our views on the draft TSCA Modernization Act of 2015. We commend Chairman Shimkus, Chairman Upton, and Ranking Member Pallone for their bipartisan efforts to reform TSCA for the first time since it was enacted in 1976. Automakers work diligently to identify and reduce substances of concern in automobiles. We have eliminated the use of mercury switches and lead wheel weights. We continue to phase out the use of the flame retardant DECA, and we are eliminating copper from brake pads. Autos are also one of the most recycled consumer products. Nearly 90% of a vehicle's material content is recycled or reused. But clearly there is more work to do to protect the public and environment from harmful chemical substances, and we want to be part of the solution. We welcome this discussion draft and believe it will enhance EPA's ability to more effectively regulate potentially harmful chemicals while providing industry a clear and consistent regulatory environment. Let me take a moment to highlight some specific areas of interest to our industry. First, we support the manner in which this draft seeks to regulate chemicals and articles. This approach is consistent with existing EPA policy, which has traditionally recognized the complexity of regulating chemicals and articles by exempting them from most TSCA requirements. We understand the potential need to regulate articles in certain circumstances, but this should be based on risk of exposure to the chemical in question. For example, there is a clear difference between the risks of exposure to a chemical substance in a baby bottle versus an engine component underneath the hood of a car. Secondly, we believe that vehicles should be serviced with parts as produced, meaning those service parts use the materials that were acceptable when the vehicle was designed, certified, and warranted. Replacement part demand is very small. It's generally 1 to 5% of all vehicle parts, and it declines over time as the vehicle fleet is retired. But since the average age of a vehicle on the road today is 11 years, replacement parts must be available for many years so that those vehicles can be serviced and maintained. There's often some confusion of how vehicle replacement parts are produced, so let me briefly explain this model. Automakers typically put a marginal supply of those parts in stock while the vehicle is still in production. And to the extent that customers need replacement parts beyond that initial stock, there is a production on-demand market, and suppliers continue to produce them using the same materials, the same production process, and the same engineering specifications as for the original vehicle. So while replacement parts might theoretically be able to be redesigned for vehicles no longer in production, there are technical and logistical barriers that often make such redesign infeasible, if not impossible. I would also note that similar laws regulating chemical substances have examined this issue and have opted to exempt replacement parts. Finally, we appreciate this draft's simplified approach to state preemption, which ensures that any EPA final determination will preempt state chemical regulations. However, we do recommend that the committee also consider suspending any new state action while EPA decides a chemical substance is a candidate for a risk evaluation. We are aware of the concern expressed about the passage of time while EPA considers regulatory action and are supportive of expedited timeframes for EPA action. Thank you again for inviting me to be here and discuss this important issue with you today. Congress is on the cusp of reforming TSCA for the first time in nearly 40 years, and we strongly believe that the final bipartisan product will more effectively regulate harmful chemicals in a way that protects the health and safety of all Americans while providing industry the certainty and the clarity that it needs. We look forward to working with you as this draft moves through the legislative process. I thank you again, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes Mr. Andy Egregious, Director of Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families. Welcome back. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Tonko. I'm pleased to be here, as like the other witnesses are. Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families is a coalition of 450 organizations and businesses. It ranges from the Learning Disabilities Association, Steelworkers Union, large health providers like Dignity Health, and the major national environmental organizations. We all came together to reform TSCA in 2009, and we definitely want to have it happen sooner than later, and we're glad to work with the committee toward that end. I want to highlight what we see as positive in the draft, what's missing, and some ideas for how to move forward. I want to say also up front that we think the more targeted approach that you've taken does hold a lot of promise. There's a lot that it potentially solves and points a way forward, and also to identify some of the elements that are in there that we support. The absence of a complicated prioritization scheme we think is wise. It avoids the downside of the low priority loophole that a lot of us are concerned about. You've also heard from EPA that they already have a prioritization criteria. They've gone through, they had public input, et cetera. The approach to preemption, by preserving more of TSCA's existing preemption, you avoid the controversy of the void or the suspension whereby states are blocked just because EPA is looking at something, and we appreciate that. The draft also doesn't roll back EPA's authority on products or imports, so we think you've threaded the needle on the issue of products and don't take away authority on some of these other areas. It does make it easier to require toxicity testing. It does remove the least burdensome requirement, which was an issue in the asbestos decision, and vulnerable populations are addressed, though there's some clarifications potentially needed around the rulemakings. I want to focus on the issue of cost and see if I can add some value. It was talked about a lot. We basically agreed with where EPA came down on this, that we don't see that issue as solved in this draft. And to try and put it simply, I think in our vision, you want the risk evaluations to clearly identify the risk, including the vulnerable populations, and you want the rulemaking to have to protect against that risk very clearly. And then the cost considerations, including cost effectiveness, comes into play with how EPA does that, which can mean longer time frames for implementing some particularly costly piece of the risk management. It can include choosing a more cost-effective way of addressing the risk over another way, but you don't want it to be a limitation on whether the risk is addressed at all. And that's the key distinction that we still see as potentially not solved. So it literally comes down to, will you have a risk hanging out there that EPA has identified, and at the end we'll be able to tell the story that the public is now protected from that risk and have that be true, or we potentially have the story that EPA winds up saying, we actually didn't protect against the risk because a court found that we couldn't prove that the cancer cases and the hospital visits, the lost work, et cetera, outweighed the cost to the companies to move to the safer alternative. That's the difference that this hinges on. And so I'm not sure if we have a difference of intent or of interpretation of the language, but that's the key thing we'd like to see solved, is that the risk management has to protect against the risk. We also would agree with what's been said about the imbalance between the industry assessments and the assessments EPA would undertake under its own power under the draft. Really, the industry assessments are the only thing driving EPA activity under this draft. They have to agree to these requests and they have to undertake them. And on the flip side, they have to go through some hoops before they can undertake an assessment, and that creates an imbalance that we think could lead to them looking more at the chemicals that are already being managed well or that are already safe, that have a lot of data, instead of the ones that are causing problems out in the real world right now. And so we think if you got rid of those extra barriers, put in place, this issue came up of 20 chemicals a year, a requirement perhaps to do that. That's a nice round number, maybe giving them a deadline to complete work on the chemicals that have been talked about, the 90 work plan chemicals. Then we're on our way to driving some EPA action on the chemicals, in addition to having this industry initiated assessments. We agree with what's been said about fees. I've mentioned some other issues in more detail in the written testimony around the science provisions in the bill. We think that you could take, if you're going with less is more, you can go all the way and not direct EPA to take position on some of these scientific questions. But if you're going to do that, there are places in the bill where what you're calling for is stuff that the National Academy of Sciences has actually said EPA shouldn't do, and there are some things that national academies have said EPA should do that aren't in there. And so I'd say pull back or go further with what the national academies would like to do. Persistent bioaccumulative toxins, these are the chemicals that are like PCBs, one of the only success stories of the original TSCA. There's a limited number of them, chemicals that are like that, identifying them early and requiring action. So I'll stop there, but just say that we think all of the issues that we've identified are things that could be solved in the draft. We wouldn't support the draft in its current form, but with the changes that we've talked about, it could be gotten in shape where you'd have a genuine public health achievement here.
And I thank you for your opening statement, and I'll turn myself for the start of the first round of questions, recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Walls, under Section 6 of the House discussion draft, EPA must determine that a substance presents or will present in the absence of risk management measures an unreasonable risk of injury to health or the environment. Do you believe the discussion draft establishes a workable process for evaluating risk and identifying necessary risk management measures?
Yes.
Do you believe the discussion draft provides clear direction to EPA to consider only health and environment considerations in evaluating the risk of chemical substances?
Yes.
And then, Dr. Bosley, do you agree with the bill's provision that breaks out risk evaluation, analysis of hazard and exposure as a separate question from the details of how to restrict a chemical by rulemaking?
Yes, I do.
You have previously testified that Congress should include deadlines in TSCA. The updated discussion draft contains enforceable deadlines. Does the way that the discussion draft handles this matter satisfy you?
It does. I would like to see clearer deadlines that can be achieved by EPA. That would be.
Are you concerned that deadlines might force EPA into making decisions to meet a deadline?
I'm sorry, what was
Do you think that, well, the deadline issue, which is obviously a debatable question,
Right.
would force them to make a quicker decision because of the deadline versus the science, I guess is a better way to put it. Do you think the deadlines will force them to make
a bad call?
Yeah.
I don't think so. The scientists and engineers at EPA are very talented, and I think given what we've seen with new chemicals, they are able to make decisions in a very timely manner, and I think with the correct resources for existing chemicals, I think it all hinges on that as to how quickly they can address. So with correct resources, they should be able to.
What about the debate from the business perspective and the issue of litigation on missing a deadline or the like?
Yeah, so I guess I would give, if it were me to write the bill, I would give EPA the ability to say, look, this happened, and so we need this much more time. We need another 3 months. So I would give them that ability. We wouldn't want that to go on for years and years, but I would give them the ability to say, well, there's this unforeseen circumstance and we need a little more time.
The discussion draft permits the manufacturer to request EPA to conduct a risk evaluation of a chemical substance. Do you agree that this process can help EPA accelerate the review of existing chemicals in commerce?
I should think it would, yes.
And in your business, do you conduct a basic risk evaluation of your chemical products, and could that information inform EPA's review of a substance?
We do. We don't do a reaction in the lab without performing a risk evaluation beforehand.
So it kind of addresses some of the questions we had to Mr. Jones on
Right.
definitive timelines, and I guess to you, and then I'll go to Mr. Walls. Talk about what would industry do if they're going to pay a fee to have a chemical reviewed. Would you think that there'd be then a partnership that the sectors would be trying to work together, or you would think they would just do that without providing information?
Oh, no, I would think they would work together.
I mean, because that would help you expedite
Sure.
the system. You could check your...
In my case, for a small business, I would suspect we would have less to add than maybe a larger business, because I don't have any toxicologists on staff, for instance. So I would rely on EPA toxicologists. So it may differ between the actual business and the actual circumstance, how much information would be given. But we would always try to participate very heavily with EPA.
And Mr. Walls?
Mr. Shimkus, I think what's been the hallmark of Section 5 right now, the new chemical review provision, has it been that it's promoted a dialogue between the industry and EPA. I would see the same sort of circumstance applying here in the manufacturer-initiated process.
And that, again, back to you, Mr. Walls and Dr. Bosley. And then in this process, under new chemicals, are you confident that confidential business information as you're going through this process with the EPA is currently being protected? And obviously that is a concern that we try to address a little bit.
The EPA has very rigorous controls to protect confidential information, yes.
I'm confident all of our information is protected.
Great. I think that's all I have. So with that, and Mr. Gige, we look forward to continuing to working with you, because obviously we're moving forward. There's some bipartisan interest, and we want to continue to be open. So let's keep working together. With that, I yield back my time and turn to the ranking member, Mr. Tonko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again to all the members of the panel. Your testimony is obviously very helpful, and we appreciate your participation. I'd like to follow up on the earlier questions I had of the first panel member. And under the draft, manufacturers would have unlimited ability to require EPA to conduct risk evaluations. And there is no required number of EPA-initiated risk evaluations. Mr. Egregious, do you find that to be a concern?
We do. I would share the concern that Mr. Jones raised, that if they really don't have the ability the discretion to turn down the request, and then they have to complete it under an expedited time frame, I imagine that those risk evaluations, the imprimatur of safety would be valuable to a number of companies. There are a number of companies who have developed data. They would bring that forward. And even if that's all on the up and up, in other words, even if EPA agrees, and we would agree looking at the data, if that winds up being most of what they do, you're really not dealing with the chemicals that are causing a problem for public health and the environment right now. So even if you take the process at the most positive view of it. But I think there is another element too, which is, as far as I can tell, the burden of proof would still be on EPA. So they have to undertake this evaluation, but then the burden of proof is still on them if they find an unreasonable risk to prove with substantial evidence, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not that they're not, they'd be doing it a little bit under the gun in that sense. It's not like the drug burden of proof that we have.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Jones spoke about the need for clarification to ensure that determinations as a risk must be acted on would not include cost considerations. Do you agree that EPA's determinations of whether a chemical substance needs risk management should be made without cost considerations?
We would agree with what he said, that they should identify the risk cleanly, health only. Is this causing an unreasonable amount of risk, cancer, learning disabilities, birth defects, et cetera? And then the rule should be required to adequately protect against the risk. And then the cost considerations should be sort of behind that line. How you do that? How quickly can we phase in alternatives? How quickly can we impose these restrictions? That's where the role of cost should come in. And it's the draft. We would agree with him that it's a judgment call, and we are concerned that a court could find that the old balancing still applies. And as we know from the asbestos decision, that was where you had risks that were so severe, you had an unusual level of quantifiableness to the health costs of asbestosis and mesothelioma, and the court still found that EPA couldn't prove that those quantifiable costs outweighed the benefits that asbestos brought to the economy. So it's a big issue that has to be gotten right.
So I'm hearing a little clarification needed in the language of the draft. What about our other panelists in that regard to the cost language?
Oh, yeah, I think that clarification there to give EPA guidance would be very helpful. We wouldn't want it to end up in the courts as well.
Mr. Tonko, I think the discussion draft reflects a desire to ensure that EPA continues to have the discretion, a considerable amount of discretion in managing the process, et cetera. I don't think that the language in and of itself mandates that EPA adopt a process that raises the very same problems we have under current law. I think the intent is clear to do something different if it takes an additional clarification to get there. I hesitate to...
If left as is, does it invite additional litigation?
It might, but I think the clear intention here is that, you know, EPA ought to be taking a very reasonable approach and looking at what are the costs and efficiencies related to the regulatory options under discussion.
But I think we can agree that we all want to avoid any threat of additional litigation. Ms. Thomas?
I would agree with Mr. Walls and just add that, you know, as an end user of chemicals, we strongly believe that cost should be a factor in the risk management process.
And if we can turn to the use of science, Mr. Gracious, do you have concerns about the requirements to use the weight of the scientific evidence as defined in this draft?
Yes, we do. Even though that phrase sounds innocuous, the National Academy of Sciences weighed in a report that Congress requested saying that the phrase was ambiguous, and we're concerned that it could cause some needless delays and potentially litigation hooks over what kind of information was included and referred to by EPA in an assessment.
Thank you. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee, Mr. Harper, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to each of you for being here. Ms. Thomas, if I may ask you a few questions, what is the typical lead time from, say, the design to the time that a new car is going to show up on the showroom floor?
Thank you for your question, and you know, it varies amongst automakers, but generally lead time is 5 to 7 years for a new production model. It's obviously longer for advanced technologies like electric vehicles, but that goes back to the article's debate and why if EPA were to take action on a chemical substance in an article, there should be, you know, lead time should be considered in that process.
So when EPA is looking at what they're going to do in a situation, that is something you believe they should take into account? Is that significant lead time on what they're going to try to do?
Absolutely, because we need that time to obviously make the necessary changes, and suitable alternatives should also be available.
What are some practical examples from your members that help illustrate why you're seeking these changes to TSCA?
So, you know, our top priority is one single national program for chemical management, and that be implemented at the federal level. You know, a patchwork of inconsistent, conflicting state requirements just imposes a huge burden on complex durable goods manufacturers like automakers. We manufacture vehicles to meet customer needs and to be sold in all 50 states, and inconsistent requirements, like for example, there's California and Washington State have brake friction standards to eliminate heavy metals and asbestos, and you know, as much as they have tried to harmonize those regulations, there's still inconsistencies that we require a lot of resources and significant time, obviously.
So you can't have 50 different cars, the same car designed 50 different ways to sell in each state.
No, that would be quite challenging.
Although sometimes you feel like that's what you might have to do. Please explain the technical, economic, and logistical barriers that often make such redesign of replacement parts infeasible, if not perhaps impossible to achieve.
Sure. So like I indicated, there's a lot of confusion around this area. You know, we're not talking about all automobile parts, and we certainly don't believe that they should be exempt from TSCA requirements. We're talking about a small universe of parts, 1 to 5% of vehicle production parts, and it's critical that those parts are needed to service and maintain the existing fleet. And you know, the average age of a car is 11 years old. We're making vehicles that last longer these days, and so we have to be able to repair them and service them. And so that's why that exemption is necessary.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bosley, you have long been an advocate for maintaining Section 5 and ensuring strong CBI protections. Does this updated discussion draft appropriately handle those sections to your satisfaction?
It does. We're very happy with the maintaining CBI with substantiation, and we're also happy to resubstantiate or not after a certain amount of years. Section 5 works very well. The deadlines are adequate, and EPA can always extend if they need it, so we're very happy with Section 5.
Do you believe that generic names and unique chemical qualifiers or identifiers will provide the public concrete enough information about your chemical without giving away your intellectual property?
I think so. I think that manufacturers work with EPA to provide robust generic chemical names that might identify the portion of the molecule that's causing the concern or the hazard, and that's where we need to get to.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair recognizes the ranking member of full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I discussed with the first panel, I see some areas for improvement, but I also think there are a lot of strong points in the chairman's discussion draft. So let me start with Mr. Egregious. I'm particularly interested in your analysis that leaving the unreasonable risk language in place, along with the heightened standard of judicial review, could perpetuate the problems EPA has faced in regulating dangerous chemicals. So do you think an important measure of any TSCA reform proposal is whether it empowers EPA to regulate known dangerous chemicals like asbestos, for example?
Certainly. I think that's the main lesson from the asbestos decision.
Okay. Do you think it's important that any TSCA reform proposal provide for expedited action to manage the risks from chemicals that are persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic?
Absolutely.
And why is this expedited action important for those chemicals?
The lesson from the TSCA's action on polychlorinated biphenyls, which is something TSCA originally did, is that those qualities taken together mean the chemical is around for a longer time, and the risk winds up compounding because it builds up in the food chain. So the levels go up for the end user, for people, over time, and so you need to identify them earlier and take more aggressive action to restrict them earlier, even to see the public health improvements 20 years later. And that's the story of PCBs.
Well, going back to PCBs, do you think that naming those chemicals in the statute help move the risk management forward? And would you support something similar for PBT chemicals?
Well, we certainly would. We've supported that in the past. That's the simplest way of having them in the draft. You could also put in criteria for PBTs and require EPA to do the identification, but naming them is fastest.
And I hope that we can work with the chairman as we move forward to include authorities for, you know, the way you suggested. I believe the draft shows the chairman's intent to ensure that the problems identified in corrosion-proof fittings are addressed, and that's an intent I share. I just wanted to, if I could, in the time I have left, if I could just call attention to some of the strengths in this draft, which reflect points of strong agreement between stakeholders. And I just wanted to go down the line, you know, if as much as possible, just answer yes or no, and ask each of you to answer these questions. Do you support removing the least burdensome language that has been an obstacle to EPA action under Section 6? Mr. Wallace?
Yes.
Wallace, I mean, yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Is the reporter able to get that? All right. Do you support giving EPA authority to require testing through orders, not just rulemaking? Mr. Walls?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I don't want to go too fast. Do you all support upfront substantiation of future CBI claims?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Do you all support explicit protections for vulnerable populations?
Yes, so I think the discussion draft appropriately acknowledges the need to address potentially exposed populations.
I do.
Dr. Bosley?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Okay. Do you all see these changes in the draft as valuable?
Yes, although I wouldn't necessarily agree, Mr. Pallone, with Mr. Egregious's comments regarding asbestos and PBTs, because the discussion draft limits in no way EPA's discretion to identify true priorities. But other than that, yes, we support changes.
Dr. Bosley?
We support as well.
We support
Thomas?
as well.
Yes.
Okay. And, well, again, I got through this fairly quickly. I guess when you ask yes or no questions, it's easier to get through everything quickly. So I just want to thank the chairman for working with us as we move forward to get this done. Thanks again. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time, Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Schrader, 5 minutes.
I pass, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman passes, and Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say I appreciate your bipartisan work on getting this draft ready.
Don't let that information out.
Okay. I'll be careful not to. Mr. Agreyas, I'm going to ask about the Catch-22 provision here. I don't think that's been asked yet. The may present unreasonable risk. Could you explain why that's a Catch-22 and what we can do about that in the draft?
Sure. It's, I think the lesson of TSCA, and because of the approach in this draft, I think it got a lot of us looking back at original TSCA more, and you read it, and there's a lot of things that sound reasonable, that sound like they should have worked, and it just turned out that when a court got into them and EPA anticipating that, they didn't. They really turned out to be significant barriers to EPA acting, and I think this would be in that category. On its face, it sounds like before EPA should get started, shouldn't they decide, well, this might be something that's a problem? But the history, I think, of this statute and of EPA interpreting it is that it could trip them up substantially. If they really have to show that it may before they undertake the evaluation to see if it does, it seems unnecessary in the spirit of the more stripped-down approach and expediting them taking action.
Okay. Now, the heightened standard of judicial review, EPA actions taken under TSCA must be supported by substantial evidence in the rulemaking record, and that is a substantially higher, well, that's a significantly higher than the arbitrary and capricious standard that's normally used for EPA rules. Could you comment on how that could be improved in the TSCA?
I would think taking it out would be the improvement in having arbitrary and capricious applied to this statute as well. I mean, one of the things I think is lost is it's not just that the court threw out the EPA rulemaking on asbestos, but that because of substantial evidence, it took EPA 10 years to put together that record. I think it was a 40,000-page record. And so it has an impact on how much time how much EPA feels it has to put under its feet in order to go forth and make a rulemaking, in addition to the risk of something getting thrown out of court. So we feel it being removed would put it in line with other environmental laws.
Well, in my understanding, is the supported by substantial evidence in the rulemaking record is what prevented the rules on asbestos from being implemented.
That's right.
And that's clearly a disadvantage. Of
It was a third leg of the stool, so to speak, in preventing EPA from taking action on asbestos.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Seeing no other members present, I want to thank the panel for coming. It was a pretty good hearing. I think there's things that we want to continue to discuss. I did announce a date for a subcommittee mark, and the only thing I'll say too is as we move forward, we don't have to get it perfect right the first bite. We have subcommittee, we have full committee, and then we'll have to, hopefully the Senate will move something. We go to conference, there's going to be a lot of opportunities to, but I appreciate the positive comments from my colleagues. I understand the issues that they have concern. We look forward to really having an opportunity to get this thing done, and we look for your input to be able to do that. So I will dismiss the second panel, and I'll ask unanimous consent that all members of the subcommittee have 5 legislative days to submit opening statements for the record. I also ask unanimous consent that the following letters to the subcommittee regarding the discussion draft and our hearing today be included in the record. Letters are from the American Cleaning Institute, the Environmental Working Group, the Bipartisan Policy Center, Society of Toxicologists, the American Alliance for Justice, and a statement by Dr. Paul Locke. Without objection, so ordered, and I will adjourn the hearing.